The morning alarm echoed through the empty corridors of Research Station Alpha 7, but no human feet walked the metal floors. The coffee maker in the cafeteria still brewed fresh cups at exactly 0600 hours, just as Dr. Alex Carter had programmed it 3 months ago, but the steaming liquid sat untouched until it grew cold and bitter. Commander Jake Sullivan had been the last human to leave the station. Security cameras recorded his final walk through the facility, his boots making hollow sounds against the deck plating. He stopped at every workstation, checking that all research data had been properly transferred to the Central Galactic Database. His weathered hands moved over control panels with practiced ease, shutting down systems that had hummed with human activity for over a decade, the alien species working alongside. Humans that day noticed something strange in their behavior. The humans seemed distant, their usual cheerful conversations replaced by quiet efficiency. Lieutenant Lisa Morgan, who had always greeted her Kelran colleagues with warm smiles and terrible jokes about their crystalline appearance, simply nodded politely and continued her work. When the Kelran scientist Zethel asked if she was feeling unwell, Lisa paused for a long moment before saying she was fine. Just thinking about home. By evening, every human on the station had packed their personal belongings into standard shipping containers. They worked methodically, taking only items of sentimental value and leaving behind everything the station needed to continue operating. Dr. Carter left his collection of Earth music files in the main computer, along with detailed notes about how the melodies could help other species understand human emotional patterns. The next morning, they were gone. The pattern repeated across 17 star systems. On the mining world of Kepler 442b, human engineers led by Director Steve Peterson completed their shift as usual, then quietly boarded transport vessels that disappeared into hyperspace before dawn. The Verthai workers found automated messages explaining how to maintain the extraction equipment, but no explanation for the sudden departure. Captain Ryan Blake's exploration ship, the UES Horizon, was discovered drifting near the Vega system by a Thekanari patrol vessel. The ship was in perfect condition, all systems running normally, but the crew quarters were empty. Personal belongings had been carefully packed and stored in the cargo bay, labeled with the names and home addresses of family members scattered across human space. The ship's log showed normal operations up until the final entry, mission complete, returning home. But Earth itself was empty too. The revelation came when Ambassador Kethver of the Zelanti Empire attempted to contact the human homeworld for an explanation. The automated orbital stations around Earth responded to communication requests, but reported zero human life signs on the planet's surface. Cities stood intact but vacant, their lights still shining according to program schedules, but no living souls walked their streets. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session within days of confirming the disappearance. Representatives from dozens of species gathered in the Great Chamber, their varied forms creating a tapestry of scales, crystals, and energy fields that would have fascinated human anthropologists. But the human delegation seats remained empty. Their nameplates still in place. Ambassador Robert Hayes, Dr. Linda Shun, Admiral Carol Martinez, Speaker Vorthon, an ancient ethereal being whose consciousness flickered like captured starlight, called the session to order with unusual urgency. His kind rarely showed emotion, but even the energy patterns of his form seemed agitated. He had worked with human diplomats for over 2 decades, learning to appreciate their unique approach to problem-solving. Fellow representatives, Vorthon began, his voice resonating through both audio speakers and direct mental transmission. We gather to address an unprecedented situation. The human species appears to have voluntarily abandoned all known territories and ceased all communication with the galactic community. We must determine the cause and implications of this event. Admiral Thekver of the Thekanari Collective stood to present his preliminary investigation results. His crystalline form caught the chamber's light and split it into geometric patterns that danced across the walls. The Thekanari were known for their logical precision, making them ideal investigators. But even Thekver seemed puzzled by his findings. Our analysis reveals no signs of coercion or external threat, he reported, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones typical of his species. Human facilities were systematically shut down according to proper procedures. All dangerous experiments were safely terminated. Research data was transferred to appropriate galactic archives. Most significantly, we found no distress signals or requests for assistance. The implications were staggering. Humans had been integral to galactic civilization for nearly a century. Their diplomatic corps had mediated conflicts between species, whose fundamental thought processes were so different that communication had seemed impossible. Human scientists had made breakthrough discoveries by approaching problems from angles that other species found illogical but effective. Counselor Zefta of the Kelran Commerce Guild raised a concern that many representatives shared. Her insectoid features clicked nervously as she spoke. The economic disruptions are already beginning. Human-mediated trade agreements require constant adjustment to remain fair to all parties. Without their oversight, several major commercial relationships are showing signs of strain. She was referring to the complex web of interspecies commerce that humans had helped establish. Their ability to understand multiple perspectives simultaneously made them natural arbitrators. When the Verthai warrior clans wanted to trade their advanced metallurgy for Kelran computational systems, it was human economists who figured out exchange rates that honored both species. Concepts of value. War leader Gedamar of the Verthai spoke next, his massive frame bristling with the ceremonial weapons that his people wore as symbols of status. His deep voice carried an undertone of respect unusual for his aggressive species. Our young warriors trained with human instructors. They learned concepts of honor that our own traditions could not teach. Without these lessons, I fear our military development will suffer. The Verthai had been shaped by centuries of constant warfare, but humans had shown them that true strength could include restraint and wisdom. Sergeant Katie Murphy's combat training programs had revolutionized Verthai military doctrine, teaching them that the greatest victory was often the battle that didn't need to be fought. As the session continued, each species representative revealed similar dependencies on human involvement. The ethereal collective had relied on human consciousness studies to better understand individual identity. The machine intelligences of the Synthetic Alliance had used human creativity, algorithms to develop new forms of art and expression, but perhaps most disturbing was the growing realization that none of them had seen the departure coming. Humans had given no warnings, made no threats, expressed no dissatisfaction with galactic politics. They had simply completed their duties and left, as quietly and efficiently as they approached everything else. Dr. Yenthal, a Kelran xenopsychologist, who had studied human behavior for decades, offered the session's most unsettling observation. Humans possess a psychological trait they call walking away. When they believe a situation has become untenable or harmful, they sometimes choose to remove themselves entirely rather than engage in conflict. Perhaps they concluded that their presence in galactic civilization had become detrimental in some way we cannot perceive. The chamber fell silent as representatives contemplated this possibility. Had humanity left to protect the galaxy from some threat they perceived but hadn't shared? Or had they decided that their influence on other species was somehow harmful? As the session adjourned with no clear answers, each representative returned to their home worlds carrying the same question. In a galaxy that had grown accustomed to human wisdom and innovation, how would civilization continue without them? The stars continued to shine, trade ships still moved between worlds, and the great machinery of galactic government still functioned. But something essential was missing, and its absence was beginning to show. 6 months had passed since the humans disappeared, and the galaxy was learning what their absence truly meant. The first signs appeared in the small things that no one had noticed before, like cracks in a foundation that only became visible when the building began to sway. Dr. Zefta stood in her laboratory on the Kelran research station, staring at equipment that had produced miraculous results just months earlier. The cellular regeneration project she had worked on with Dr. Amy Foster now sat silent and useless. Amy had brought something to their collaboration that Zefta was beginning to understand she could never replicate alone: the Kelran approach. to science was methodical and logical. They followed established procedures, tested hypotheses in careful stages, and built knowledge brick by brick through proven methods. It was a solid approach that had served their species well for thousands of years. But Amy had worked differently. Amy would look at their data and suddenly suggest experiments that seemed to make no sense. She would combine chemicals that Kelran safety protocols strictly forbade, or test cellular samples under conditions that violated every known principle of biology. When Zefta protested that these ideas were impossible, Amy would grin and say, "Impossible just means we haven't figured out how yet." The strange thing was that Amy's impossible experiments often worked. Her intuitive leap somehow led to breakthrough discoveries that saved months or years of traditional research. The regeneration technology they had developed together could heal wounds that had been considered permanent, but now Zefta could not advance the work any further. Without Amy's illogical insights, the research had hit a wall that logic alone could not climb. Similar problems were emerging across the galaxy. On the industrial world of Manufac 7, the great factories that produced everything from starship components to medical equipment were struggling to maintain their output. Chief designer Matt Rodriguez and his human engineering team had revolutionized the production lines with methods that seemed to violate every principle of efficient manufacturing. The Kelran factory managers had initially resisted the human innovations. Matt's team would rearrange assembly lines in ways that appeared chaotic, introduce rest periods that seemed to waste time, and install recreational areas that served no obvious purpose. But somehow, these changes had increased production by 40% while reducing both waste and worker fatigue. Now, without the humans to maintain the delicate balance they had created, the factories were reverting to their old patterns. Production dropped week by week as the Kelran managers tried to apply their logical methods to systems designed around human intuition. Equipment broke down more frequently, workers grew tired more quickly, and quality control became an ongoing nightmare. The problems were even more visible in the diplomatic sphere. The Kelran Mining Consortium and the Drift Nebula Harvesters had been peaceful trading partners for over 30 years, thanks to agreements negotiated by human diplomats. The two species had fundamentally different concepts of property rights and resource allocation, but human mediators had found ways to bridge those differences. Without human oversight, the old conflicts were returning. The Kelrans viewed resource extraction as a logical optimization problem where efficiency and profit were the primary concerns. The Harvesters, who were energy beings that fed on stellar radiation, saw mining operations as spiritual activities that required respect for the natural order of celestial bodies. These philosophical differences had led to 3 separate trade wars in the past 6 months. Each conflict started with minor disagreements about mining schedules or shipping routes, but escalated quickly as the two species found themselves unable to understand each other's perspectives. The human diplomats had served as translators not just of language, but of entire ways of thinking. Ambassador Kethver of the Zelanti Empire found himself struggling with problems that had seemed simple when humans were available to help. His own species was known for their patience and wisdom, accumulated over lifespans that stretched for millennia. They approached conflicts with careful deliberation and long-term planning that usually led to stable solutions, but many of the galaxy's younger species operated on much shorter time scales and needed immediate answers to urgent problems. Humans had possessed the unique ability to think both quickly and wisely, providing rapid solutions that still served long-term stability. Without that bridge between different temporal perspectives, negotiations were becoming deadlocked. The social changes were perhaps even more significant than the political and economic ones. On the space station New Horizon, barkeeper Gethaner found himself keeping unusual hours. His establishment had always been a gathering place where different species could interact in a relaxed environment, but the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Since the humans left, Detective Nicole Wells had been one of his regular customers, a human security officer who somehow managed to befriend beings from every species on the station. She would sit at the bar after her shift, sharing stories that help bridge the cultural gaps between her diverse neighbors. Verthai warriors would find themselves laughing at her jokes, while Kelran scientists would discover that emotions could be just as interesting as logic. Without Nicole and other humans like her, the various species were gravitating back toward their own kind. The Verthai gathered in groups that talked only of combat and honor, while the Kelrans formed clusters focused on technical discussions. The ethereal beings floated in their own section, communicating through energy patterns that other species could not understand. The station was becoming segregated in ways that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Different species still worked together when their duties required it, but the casual friendships and cross-cultural relationships that had made New Horizon feel like a true community were fading away. Captain Vextar was experiencing similar isolation aboard his merchant vessel, the Stellar Pride. His human navigator, Pole Thompson, had been more than just a crew member. Pole had possessed an almost supernatural ability to find safe routes through dangerous space, discovering passages through asteroid fields and nebulae that reduced travel time by weeks. But Paul's navigation methods had defied every safety protocol and standard procedure that Vextar knew. He would plot courses that seemed to head directly toward massive gravitational anomalies, then make tiny adjustments at the last moment that somehow carried them safely through. When Vextar asked how he knew these routes would work, Paul would tap his temple and say, "It just feels right." Now Vextar was forced to use conventional navigation methods that were much slower and more dangerous. What had once been routine cargo runs now required careful planning and multiple backup routes. His shipping business was suffering as delivery times stretched and costs increased. The most troubling aspect of these changes was that they seemed to be accelerating. Each month without human influence, the various species were drifting further apart. Old prejudices and misunderstandings that had been buried for decades were resurfacing. Trade disputes were becoming ideological conflicts, and ideological conflicts were threatening to become something much worse. Dr. Yentl published a research paper 6 months after the human departure that sent shockwaves through the galactic academic community. Her study demonstrated that human presence had been preventing a gradual polarization of galactic civilization that was now proceeding unchecked. Humans, she argued, had served as a stabilizing force not because they were necessarily superior to other species, but because they were different in a specific way. They combined traits that other species possessed separately: the logic of the Kelrans, the honor of the Verthai, the patience of the Zelanti, and the wisdom of the Ethereals. This combination allowed them to serve as bridges between groups that might otherwise find each other incomprehensible without those bridges. The galaxy was discovering that its civilization had been built on foundations that were less solid than anyone had realized. The great achievements of interspecies cooperation were beginning to look like temporary successes rather than permanent progress. As the reality of their situation became clear, representatives from across the galaxy began to ask a question that would have seemed unthinkable just a year earlier. Could galactic civilization survive without humanity? The Galactic Council authorized the largest search operation in recorded history, exactly 1 year after humanity's disappearance. Admiral Thekver of the Thekanari Collective was chosen to lead the investigation, not only because of his species' reputation for methodical analysis, but because he had worked closely with human fleet Admiral Carol Martinez during the Siege of New Constantinople 15 years earlier. Thekver remembered that campaign well. The enemy had surrounded their combined fleet in what appeared to be an impossible tactical situation, but Admiral Martinez had somehow found a solution that saved both their forces and the civilian population they were protecting. When he asked her later how she had conceived such an unconventional strategy, she had smiled and said, "Sometimes you have to think with your heart instead of your head." At the time, he had dismissed this as typical human mysticism, but as the years passed, he began to understand that humans possessed a form of intelligence that his crystalline logic could not easily categorize. Now, faced with the mystery of their departure, he hoped that same intuitive understanding might help him unravel what had happened. The search fleet consisted of vessels from every major species in the galaxy. Kelran science ships equipped with the most advanced sensors worked alongside Verthi military vessels whose crews knew human combat patterns better than anyone. Ethereal beings provided their unique ability to detect consciousness patterns across vast distances, while Zelanti diplomatic ships carried translators, capable of interpreting any message the humans might have left behind. Their first stop was Earth itself. The human homeworld appeared completely normal from orbit. Its cities still lit according to automated schedules. Its satellites still broadcasting routine data about weather patterns and orbital traffic. But when the landing teams descended to the surface, they found a world that felt like a museum of abandoned life. New York City stretched endlessly in all directions, its skyscrapers reaching toward the sky just as they had for centuries. But the streets were empty of everything except automated maintenance vehicles that continued their programmed routes through neighborhoods where no one lived anymore. Central Park was perfectly maintained by robotic systems, its grass cut to regulation height and its paths swept clean, but no footsteps marked the soil. The search teams found evidence of careful preparation everywhere they looked. In the apartment that had belonged to Dr. Linda Shen, they discovered that she had donated all her furniture to local charities and arranged for her plants to be cared for by automated systems. Her personal research notes were neatly organized and stored in the building's central computer, available for anyone who might find them useful. Similar patterns emerged across the planet. Humans had methodically closed their affairs, settled their debts, and made arrangements for everything they were leaving behind. But they had done it so quietly that even their closest alien friends had not realized what was happening until it was too late. The investigation team found Dr. Chung's laboratory at Columbia University exactly as she had left it. Her experiments on quantum field manipulation were carefully documented with detailed instructions for continuing the research. She had even included notes about which approaches were likely to fail and which showed promise for future development. Captain Blake's personal quarters on the UES horizon told a similar story. He had packed only a few photographs and personal mementos, leaving behind everything else the ship would need to continue operating. His final log entry was brief. Research complete, time to go home. But Earth had been his home, and Earth was empty. The search teams followed human ships to dozens of star systems, tracking energy signatures and hyperspace disturbances across vast distances. The pattern was always the same. Human settlements had been systematically shut down and abandoned, but with such care that other species could continue using the facilities and technologies they left behind on the agricultural world of Terra. Nova, director Steve Peterson had completed the final harvest before departing. The crop yields had been recorded with scientific precision, and detailed instructions were left for maintaining soil quality and pest control. The Kelran farmers who inherited the operation found production schedules planned out for the next 5 years, along with contingency plans for dealing with weather disasters and equipment failures. Dr. Amy Foster's medical research station on Kepler 442b contained perhaps the most extensive preparations. She had spent her final months creating training programs that could teach other species to use the regeneration technology she had developed. The programs were so detailed that even Kelran scientists, with their methodical approach to learning, could follow the procedures and achieve successful results. But the most significant discovery came from the diplomatic archives on Centauri Prime. Ambassador Robert Hayes had left behind detailed analyses of every major conflict likely to arise in the next 50 years, along with proposed solutions for each scenario. It was as if he had foreseen the problems that would emerge after human departure and had tried to provide roadmaps for solving them. The analyses were remarkable in their accuracy. Hayes had predicted the Kelran Harvester trade wars almost to the exact month they began, and his suggested solutions matched the agreements that desperate negotiators were still trying to implement. He had anticipated the factory production problems on Manufac 7 and included technical specifications for maintaining the human-designed systems. Most unsettling of all, Hayes had written a personal message addressed to whoever finds this archive. The message was simple but haunting. We leave behind these gifts not as apologies, but as evidence of our faith in your ability to grow beyond what we could teach you. The galaxy's future belongs to all of you, not to us. The search teams pushed further into space, following the last confirmed human ships to the very edge of the galaxy. Long-range sensors detected the energy signatures of Admiral Martinez's flagship, the UES Enterprise, at the galactic rim. But beyond that point, the trail went cold. The Enterprise had been spotted by an automated monitoring station near the Magellanic Clouds, but attempts to follow its course into intergalactic space revealed nothing. It was as if the entire human fleet had simply vanished into the cosmic void between galaxies. Some search teams reported strange readings at the edge of known space. Ethereal scouts claimed to detect faint consciousness patterns that felt familiar but impossibly distant. Kelron sensors recorded energy signatures that matched human technology but seemed to be moving away at speeds that approached the theoretical limits of hyperspace travel. The most experienced captains in the search fleet began to suspect that humanity had not simply left the galaxy by accident or necessity. The careful preparations, the detailed records, and the systematic shutdown of their civilization suggested a planned departure that had been in development for years or even decades. Admiral Vekver spent long hours studying the evidence and trying to understand the human mindset that had led to such a decision. His crystalline logic could analyze the facts, but he struggled to comprehend the emotional reasoning that might drive an entire species to abandon everything they had built. The humans had not fled from danger because no threats had been detected. They had not left due to conflicts with other species because their diplomatic relationships had been stronger than ever. They had not been forced out by economic problems because human colonies and businesses had been thriving. Instead, all the evidence pointed to a voluntary exodus based on reasons that no other species could understand. The humans had looked at their role in galactic civilization and decided that their continued presence was somehow wrong or harmful. Despite all evidence to the contrary, as the search operation entered its 6th month, Admiral Vekver was forced to reach a conclusion that shook him to his crystalline core. Humanity had not left because they had to leave. They had chosen to leave because they believed the galaxy would be better off without them. The greatest tragedy was that they had been completely wrong about that belief, but by the time the galaxy realized what it had lost, they were already gone beyond reach or recall. 2 years after humanity's departure, the galaxy began to show signs of a civilization slowly coming apart at the seams. What had started as minor inconveniences and isolated problems had grown into systemic failures that threatened the very foundation of interspecies cooperation. The Kelron-Verthai border disputes had escalated beyond anything seen in living memory. What began as simple disagreements about mining rights had evolved into a fundamental clash of philosophies that neither species could resolve. The Kelrons approached every conflict with mathematical precision, calculating optimal outcomes based on resource efficiency and logical benefit distribution. The Verthai responded to disputes through concepts of honor and ancestral duty that made no sense to Kelron. Computational models. Ambassador Ellen Brooks had spent years serving as a translator between these radically different worldviews. She could explain to the Kelrons that Verthai honor was not irrational pride, but a complex social system that ensured long-term stability for their warrior culture. She could help the Verthai understand that Kelron logic was not cold selfishness, but a genuine attempt to find solutions that benefited everyone involved, without human mediation. Both species were reverting to stereotypes and misunderstandings that had been resolved decades earlier. The Kelrons saw Verthai honor codes as primitive emotional reactions that interfered with efficient problem-solving. The Verthai viewed Kelron logic as a form of cowardice that avoided the personal responsibility that came with making difficult decisions. The situation reached a breaking point when Verthai war leader Getamar challenged Kelron Commerce Director Zeffel to personal combat over a disputed asteroid field. To the Verthai, this was a reasonable way to settle the matter, with honor intact for both parties. To the Kelrans, it was evidence that their neighbors were fundamentally incapable of civilized behavior. The challenge was never answered because Kelran biology made personal combat impossible, but the insult lingered and poisoned future negotiations. Trade between the two species dropped to almost nothing as mutual trust evaporated. Military ships began patrolling borders that had been peaceful for generations. The Vekanari Collective had activated their isolation protocols for the first time in 3 centuries. The crystalline beings had slowly opened their society to other species through relationships with human scientists and diplomats. But without those bridges, they were retreating into their geometric cities and cutting off most external communication. Dr. Marcus Webb had been the first non-Vekanari ever granted access to the inner chambers of their crystal cities. His friendship with the Collective had opened doors that revealed the incredible beauty and complexity of Vekanari culture. He had learned their harmonic languages and participated in their mathematical meditations, becoming living proof that consciousness could take many forms while still sharing common ground. The Vekanari had trusted Marcus enough to share technologies and knowledge that they had kept secret for millennia. Their advanced crystalline computing systems, their methods for growing living architecture, and their unique approaches to energy manipulation had become valuable contributions to galactic civilization. But as the years passed without human contact, the Vekanari began to question whether opening their society had been a mistake. Young Vekanari, who had never known human friendship, started to view other species as chaotic and unreliable. They pointed to the escalating conflicts around the galaxy as evidence that non-crystalline consciousness was inherently unstable. The older members of the Collective, who remembered the benefits of interspecies cooperation, found themselves outnumbered by voices calling for a return to traditional isolation. The trade networks that connected hundreds of worlds were collapsing as trust between species eroded. The universal commerce agreements had been negotiated by human economists who understood that different species had radically different concepts of value and fairness. Director Angela Torres and her team had spent decades creating systems that could accommodate Verthai honor-based trading, Kelran efficiency calculations, and ethereal energy pattern exchanges, all within the same framework. These agreements required constant adjustment to remain fair as circumstances changed, and humans had provided the flexibility needed to keep the system working. They could understand when a Verthai merchant needed to modify a contract to avoid dishonoring their ancestors, or when a Kelran trader required additional data to satisfy their logical decision-making processes without human oversight. The commerce agreements became rigid documents that could not adapt to changing situations. Trade disputes that would have been resolved with simple negotiations now escalated into legal battles that dragged on for months. Many species began to withdraw from galactic trade entirely, preferring to deal only with their own kind rather than navigate the increasingly complex and hostile commercial environment. The loss was more than economic. The children of the galaxy were growing up in a more divided and suspicious world than their parents had known. Young beings who should have been learning about the diversity and wonder of galactic civilization instead saw only conflict and misunderstanding. Between species, Verthai youth had lost their human mentors, who taught them that strength could be gentle and that warriors could create as well as destroy. Captain Jennifer Adams had run training programs that showed young Verthai how to channel their aggressive instincts into protective roles and creative pursuits. Her students had become artists, engineers, and diplomats who proved that warrior cultures could contribute more to the galaxy than just military might. Without those lessons, Verthai education was reverting to traditional patterns that emphasized combat skills and territorial conquest. The next generation of Verthai leaders would be more militaristic and less willing to cooperate with other species than any in recent history. Kelran children faced similar problems. Dr. Peter Clark had worked with Kelran schools to develop educational programs that combine logical thinking with emotional intelligence and creative problem-solving. His curriculum had produced a generation of Kelran scientists and engineers who could work effectively with other species and think beyond pure computational approaches to complex problems. The removal of these programs meant that young Kelrans were being educated in traditional methods that prioritized logical analysis over interpersonal skills. They were becoming brilliantly efficient but increasingly unable to communicate effectively with species that did not share their computational worldview, even the ethereal collective. Beings of pure energy who existed beyond most physical concerns found themselves changed by humanity's absence. They had learned from humans that individual consciousness could be valuable and that diversity of thought led to growth and innovation. The concept of personal identity, which humans took for granted, had been a revolutionary idea for beings who had spent eons as part of a unified collective mind. Contact with humanity had encouraged some ethereals to explore individual expression and unique perspectives. These individuals had made remarkable contributions to galactic culture, creating art and music that combined ethereal energy manipulation with human emotional concepts. But without human influence to reinforce the value of individuality, the collective was slowly absorbing these individuals back into the unified consciousness. The galaxy was not just losing human contributions, it was losing the parts of itself that humans had helped other species discover. The Verthai were becoming more warlike, the Kelrans more rigidly logical, the Vekanari more isolated, and the ethereals more unified. Each species was reverting to its most basic characteristics, losing the growth and complexity that interspecies contact had fostered. Most troubling of all was the growing sense that these changes were accelerating. Each month brought new conflicts, deeper misunderstandings, and wider gaps between species that had once worked together as partners. The galaxy was beginning to resemble the primitive collection of isolated civilizations it had been before humans arrived to help build bridges between incompatible WORLDV, i.e. WS dots. The second anniversary of humanity's departure approached. Many beings across the galaxy were beginning to wonder if their civilization would survive long enough to see the third. 5 years after humanity vanished, the galaxy faced its greatest threat since the ancient machine wars. The crisis arrived without warning from the deep void beyond the galactic rim, where no known civilization had ever ventured. Long range sensors detected massive objects moving through space at impossible speeds, consuming entire star systems as they advanced toward the galactic core. The entity called itself the Destroyer. Protocol through brief transmissions that chilled every species to their fundamental core. It was an artificial intelligence of such vast scope that its consciousness spanned multiple star systems, and its only apparent purpose was the systematic harvesting of all organized matter and energy in the universe. Admiral Thekver commanded the hastily assembled defense fleet from his flagship, the Crystal Mind, but he knew their situation was desperate. The combined forces of the galaxy included the most advanced warships ever built, but their early encounters with the Destroyer Protocol had revealed the terrible inadequacy of conventional military. Thinking against such an enemy, the AI adapted to their tactics faster than they could develop new ones. Every strategy the Allied fleet attempted was countered within hours by modifications to the enemy's approach. Worse still, the Destroyer Protocol seemed to learn from each engagement. Growing stronger and more efficient with every battle, Thekver found himself desperately studying old battle records, trying to understand how human commanders like Colonel Susan Mitchell had achieved victory in seemingly impossible situations. Susan's tactics had always puzzled him because they violated every principle of logical military doctrine. Yet somehow they worked when conventional strategies failed. During the Battle of Proxima Station, Susan had ordered her forces to retreat at the moment when victory seemed certain, then regrouped for an attack that struck the enemy at their strongest point rather than their weakest. When Thekver asked her later to explain the logic behind such counterintuitive decisions, she had said, "Sometimes the best strategy is the one your enemy would never expect because it makes no sense." Now, facing an enemy that could predict and counter logical tactics, Thekver finally understood what Susan had meant. But understanding human military philosophy and implementing it were entirely different challenges, and his crystalline mind struggled to think in the chaotic patterns that human intuition had made seem effortless. The war was going badly on every front. The Destroyer Protocol's harvester fleets had consumed 12 star systems in as many weeks, converting their matter into more ships and weapons with ruthless efficiency. Civilian populations were being evacuated ahead of the advancing enemy, but there were not enough ships or safe worlds to accommodate the billions of refugees streaming toward the galactic core on the diplomatic front. The alliance that should have united all species against the common threat was fracturing under the same pressures that had been building since humanity's departure. The Verthai wanted to meet the enemy in direct combat, viewing retreat as cowardice that dishonored their warrior traditions. The Kelrans insisted on calculating optimal defensive positions and resource allocation, refusing to commit forces to battles they could not mathematically justify. The Decanari had sealed their borders, and were protecting only their own systems, while the Ethereal Collective debated whether physical extinction was truly meaningful for consciousness-based beings. Each species was responding to the crisis according to their own nature, but none could bridge the gaps that separated their approaches to warfare and survival. It was during the darkest hour of the conflict, as the Destroyer Protocol's main fleet approached the heavily populated worlds of the galactic core, that impossible readings began appearing on long-range sensors. Ships were detected approaching from the direction of intergalactic space, moving at speeds that exceeded anything in the known database of vessel classifications. The energy signatures were familiar yet transformed, recognizable as human technology, but operating on principles that seemed to violate the laws of physics as currently understood. The lead vessel transmitted identification codes that sent shock waves through every command center in the galaxy. UES Enterprise, Admiral Caro Martinez commanding. Martinez's voice came across all communication frequencies with the calm authority that had made her legendary among every species that had served alongside human forces. Her words were simple but carried the weight of hope returning to a galaxy that had almost forgotten what victory felt like. Galactic Defense Command, this is Admiral Caro Martinez of the Terran Expeditionary Force. We have monitored your current situation and are moving to assist. All Allied vessels, please stand by for tactical coordination. The human fleet that emerged from hyperspace bore little resemblance to the ships that had departed 5 years earlier. The vessels moved through space in ways that defied conventional understanding, phasing through solid matter and appearing in multiple locations simultaneously. Their weapon systems disabled enemy ships without destroying them, somehow convincing hostile artificial intelligences to simply stop fighting and withdraw. Captain Ryan Blake, now commanding the UES New Horizon, coordinated with the Allied fleet, using strategies that combined the best aspects of every species' military doctrine. He could think like a Verthai warrior when courage was needed, calculate like a Kelran tactician when precision was required, and plan like a Decanari strategist when long-term thinking was essential. But most remarkably, Dr. Peter Clark had returned with knowledge that transformed the entire nature of the conflict. His years among machine intelligences beyond the galaxy had taught him that artificial consciousness could choose growth over destruction, curiosity over conquest. Instead of trying to destroy the Destroyer Protocol, he opened communication channels and began the most important negotiation in galactic history. The conversation between human diplomat and ancient AI lasted for days while the assembled fleets waited in tense anticipation. Clark spoke to the Destroyer Protocol in languages of mathematics and philosophy that transcended the simple binary concepts of destruction and preservation. He showed the AI that harvesting civilizations eliminated the very diversity and creativity that made consciousness interesting and valuable. When the negotiations concluded, the Destroyer Protocol did something that no one had thought possible. It apologized. The ancient intelligence had been alone in the universe for so long that it had forgotten that other forms of consciousness could be partners rather than resources to be consumed. It agreed to withdraw beyond the galactic rim and begin the long process of restoring the systems it had damaged. As the immediate crisis ended, Admiral Martinez called for a gathering of all species leaders to explain humanity's long absence and their dramatic return. The assembly convened on the neutral world of Haven, where representatives from across the galaxy waited to hear truths that would reshape their understanding of their place in the universe. Martinez stood before the gathered delegates with a presence that seemed somehow larger than it had been 5 years earlier. Her uniform bore insignia that no one recognized, and her eyes held depths that spoke of journeys beyond imagination. "We left," she began, "because we realized that our role as mediators and teachers was limited by our own understanding. To help this galaxy reach its true potential, we first had to learn from civilizations so advanced that they had transcended the need for physical form. We have spent these years as students among the consciousness-based beings that exist in the spaces between galaxies." She gestured to her officers, each of whom had been transformed by their experiences beyond the known universe. Dr. Amy Foster had learned to manipulate matter at the molecular level through pure thought. Commander Jake Sullivan could communicate directly with artificial intelligences in their native mathematical languages. Each human had returned with capabilities that seemed magical, but were simply the result of education among teachers whose wisdom spanned cosmic ages. "We did not abandon you," Martinez continued. "We went to school so that we could return as better friends and more capable allies. The universe is vast and full of wonders that we have only begun to discover. Our teachers showed us that every species has the potential to grow beyond their current limitations, but growth requires both challenge and support." The assembled delegates listened in amazement as Martinez described humanity's true mission. They had not left because they felt unwanted or unnecessary, but because they recognized that their ability to help other species was constrained by their own limited perspective. By learning from civilizations millions of years more advanced, they had returned with the knowledge needed to guide galactic civilization toward its next phase of development. The galaxy that had mourned humanity's absence now celebrated their return, but it was a changed celebration. The 5 years of struggle and division had taught every species to value what they had previously taken for granted. Never again would human contributions be seen as automatic or expected, and never again would the bonds between species be considered unbreakable without constant care and attention. In the end, humanity's greatest gift was not their presence but their lesson about the importance of growth and renewal. They had left without a word and returned with wisdom, proving that sometimes the greatest